All right. It looks like we have a decent amount of people joining in on the phone. For everyone out there, thank you for joining us on this Veeam webinar. This is Are Your Backups Usable? Backup Testing and Automation with SureBackup. My name is Michael Burkhart. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect with AHEAD. I'm very glad to introduce to you my dear friend and cohort in crime, Byron Schaller. He's a Principal Architect with Round Tower Technologies. Today we're going to go through and kind of introduce to you various reasons and use cases for not only testing your backups, but understanding the meaning behind why we're even backing up in the first place and where that automated testing comes into play. What business value is there? What's the value for you being able to sleep at night, understanding you're not going to get those 4 a.m. calls, and assuring that your business resiliency is really there by just some simple configurations you can make with a product you already use. So what we're going to go through here, again, automated testing of our backup infrastructure with SureBackup. Why are we doing this? What problems can happen when we back up? And then also, what makes a good backup? What gets us in the green, so to speak? And then really where SureBackup dovetails into that and really makes a solid connection and firms up our infrastructure from a data protection standpoint. So again, thank you all for joining. Very glad for you to share your day with us. And my name again, Mike Burkhart. You can find me on Twitter at VMikeB. My history and background is data center technologies, again, as a solutions architect. I play with the very big Legos, right? In a previous life, I was centered and focused on end-user computing, so VDI, application virtualization. Of course, backups are imperative in that environment for network shares, etc. And then also cloud-focused. We all have kind of seen the burgeoning use of cloud services such as AWS, Azure, Google Compute, and also the private cloud on premises, etc. So I love good beer. And I'm born and raised on good beer. So, and I love boring DR tests because disaster recovery, if anything's exciting, it means it was unexpected to me, and I don't like anything unexpected. I want my DR tests to go smoothly. So don't give me bad beer, don't give me exciting DR tests. Without further ado, Byron, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you. Please introduce yourself, my friend. I think you're still out there, Byron.
Yes, totally am. So
there we go.
hi, I'm Byron Schaller. You can find me at Byron Schaller on Twitter. My background is largely enterprise cloud architecture and DevOps transformation and process optimization. I like pretty much all beer, and the thing I really dislike is data loss. And so hopefully these tests that we're going to show you today will help you prevent data loss in your environment and keep the business running. So, Mike?
Cool. At that, I'll go ahead and hand over control to you, Mr. Byron, and you can go ahead and jump on to our next slides.
There we go.
Oh,
almost.
Too many clicks.
Almost, too many clicks, right? All right, so why are we backing up our data? We're backing up our data because it's what the business needs to run. So the key here is to understand that all of these applications and all the things that we're running in our environment really are driving business services. And the idea that these are how the business makes money really makes these backups critical. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and how we evaluate that and how to go from there. So really, the main reason you back up is because your boss wants you to. Your boss tells you that we need to have this data available, we need to have the business running, and so your job as the backup admin or just overall IT admin is to make sure that that gets done. So from the business side, everything comes down to availability and avoiding downtime. Downtime is going to lose not just productivity, but really actual cash for the business. We need to find out what these business services relate to the IT services relate to the business and what that means. The goal of IT is not for IT's sake. It really is to drive the core business and to understand that. That's why I have this idea of business continuity, not just DR. So what is a business service? So you have applications, you have servers running. A business service is what is driven by all these applications. So You can have a business service of email, but that's more than just Exchange, right? So that's Exchange plus AD plus DNS plus all these ancillary services add up to the business service of email. And understanding what applications back each business service is really key to understanding how we're going to rank these business services and their underlying applications in our backup tiering, and how we're going to test and recover these in the event of an outage. So let's talk about some three-letter acronyms. Let's start with the business impact analysis. Everything that you do when it comes to backup and recovery should start with a BIA. Really what this is it's a business analysis of the underlying service and what the monetary impact is on the business if it goes down. So basically this comes down to usually dollars per hour, some kind of financial number to say, if we lose email, we lose X productivity, which means we lose X dollars an hour. This can even be more real in something like manufacturing, where you have a line, and if the line stops working, you stop making product, you can't ship, and that is real dollars lost per minute. So having the executive management and the financials team really drive this and understand what that translates to into a real dollar cost is what's going to drive your tiering and overall decisions when it comes to availability and backup and recovery. So the first thing we need to understand, once we understand what the impact is what our recovery point objective is. So our RPO. So how much data loss can you actually incur? So your RPO starts basically at your last backup. So if you can afford to lose an hour's worth of data, you have an RPO of an hour. That means that you have to have a copy no older than an hour. Anything that is created since or changed since that last backup or since that last RPO point is going to be lost in the event of any kind of outage. Next, we have our recovery time objective, our RTO. So how long do you have to get this data restored and working? It's not enough just to restore the data. You have to restore business functionality. This is sometimes called mean time to recovery or mean time to work. So once you get this data back up and the server operational, it's important that people can do work on it. So it's not really live until the business is operational. So these together, along with a few other things, are going to understand what that outage time, that outage window looks like. And it's important that your outage window aligns to your BIA and what your business allows for an outage. Now, there's a third part here, aside from RTO and RPO, and that's the failure window itself. And you have to take that into account when you're looking at your overall SLA. So, as an example, if you have a network outage or a server down, that failure window is going to be significantly smaller than if you have a total site loss. So when it comes to doing your tests and your timing and your overall practice, make sure that you account for different kinds of failure windows and how those relate to your RTOs and RPOs, and make sure that your business SLA is still met regardless of the type of failure. So availability and DR are really tied at the hip in the fact that we start with our business impact analysis. We figure out what the business is willing to lose. So let's say that you have $10,000 an hour for data loss is what you understand if email ends up going down. That's going to be your cost that you have to weigh against your BIA. The business says we're willing to lose $20,000 a year. So that's we're with a 1 hour max data loss. So that's really 2 incidents per year is what that adds up to. So understanding that what your total is and your incidents allowed per year allows you to do more accurate testing, get more accurate frames around it, understanding what your uptime needs to be. So really what we're saying here is twice a year we're allowing for 1 hour of uptime. So our RTO, or 1 hour of loss, so our RPO has to be at least 1 hour, if not less. And then our RTO has to, and with our failure window, has to add up to be no more than 10K per incident. So that gives us 5 hours total, and that's what we have to plan for going forward. Now,
I'm
all this
sorry, you
business stuff,
lose me every time I fall asleep during this business stuff. Ah, okay.
yeah, it is a little dry and pretty mathy, but it is super important to understand, why we're doing what we're doing here. Uh, so, long story short, what this means is our SLAs, whatever they are defined as, whether that's 3 nines at 99.9% uptime or 4 nines at 99.99% uptime, all drive our RTOs and RPOs, and all that's also driven by our BIA. So those all have to align. If they don't align, then your recovery objectives are going to be unrealistic, and the business is going to be dissatisfied when those SLAs are not met because that math didn't add up. So this helps us really do accurate testing. It helps us from being reactive when things happen, and it also helps us tier our apps. So not all business services are the same. So your ERP and your instant messaging service are not the same level of importance. So understanding what's a tier 1, a tier 2, a tier 3 application is going to help you adjust those RTOs and RPOs per stack, because there really is only so much time in a day, and we're also bounded by laws of physics and speed of light and things like that of how fast disks spin as to what we can adequately restore and the amount of time it takes. So understanding those business services, what their individual SLAs are, and the RTOs and RPOs, and those tiers, helps us really get a handle on how we're going to restore and what we need to restore and when. All right. So the thing is here is backups protect the business, and the business protects your paycheck. So we want our backups to always work so we get paid in the end. All right. So the emphasis is on recovery here. There a long time ago, probably 20 years ago, that there's a phrase we had that there's lots of good backup products, not a lot of good recovery products. That's luckily changed, and this emphasis on recovery and things that Veeam builds in, like CRC checks and all this stuff, to make sure that our backups are good and valid and tested, make sure that recovery is possible. There's nothing worse than having all the backups in the world having an outage and then not being able to recover because you have an untested or corrupted backup. There's so much that can go down. So little thought exercise here. So if you can lose 24 hours of data as a once daily incremental backup enough, is a once daily full backup, is a once daily full synthetic enough, and what if you can't restore that backup? It's really a moot point if that's the case. So the thing here to understand is that your backup is really a chain of events, and any break in that chain can cause total failure of your restoration process. So your source server goes down, backup server goes down. Media can do all kinds of wonky things. Tapes can age and go bad. You have failed backups. There's even application level things like inconsistency. So if you have a multi-tier app, so you have a web server, some middleware server, and a backup server, if those aren't backed up in a way that's consistent, and all three are aware of the state, if that's restored, your data can be on the disk and live and running, and your application will still fail because your middleware is inconsistent with your database, and it just won't work. And so you end up having corruption, and the whole thing fails anyway. And then the worst case scenario, your physical media gets corrupted, whether through age or through a number of things. There's just wonky things that can happen, and we need to really figure out ways to prevent that. Then everyone's favorite, ransomware. I've seen several clients personally affected by this. I know Mike has as well. It's out there. People opening emails they shouldn't. All kinds of bad things going on, and they're going after backups as well. And being prepared for that and having a contingency case in case you get ransomware throughout your environment is really a necessity, especially if you're in something like healthcare and or something like that, where it really is a life and death thing. We need to be aware that it's out there, it's pretty rampant, and have a plan for it.
What do I do?
Well, you can stop believing in things. You can decry it's the end of the world. You can just kind of give up and lay down and just call it a day. But there are better options, and Mike, let's talk about those.
All right. Well, aside from just calling it quits and changing careers, let's talk about good practices to start with. And we all know that there are things that we can do to ensure that our backups work. We can ensure that our business is protected. But let's start from the bottom, right? So the 3-2-1 rule, very easy to get. 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, and 1 offsite at least. Most of you may be doing this today. With respect to what this configuration looks like, we can consider the running production copy of data 1 copy, right? It's actively used copy of your data, hopefully valid. When that becomes invalid, a secondary copy should be either on a local disk array or a tape backup. And those files can be either localized, so if you have a lower RPO, RTO target, they're in your data center today so that they're immediately recoverable. Or if you have a longer tail and you have a longer time frame, maybe 24 hours or more, you can actually ship those tapes offsite, or you can go with Veeam Cloud Connect. Veeam has a lot of Cloud Connect providers that can integrate directly with your Veeam Backup and Recovery Suite and offload that backup copy straight into the cloud. There, no mess, no muss, no fuss. It's one of those, set this and forget. Let it archive into the cloud and then roll off as needed. Or you can currently roll your tapes off-site and do some type of cold storage if you have physical mediums and still run LTO drives. So really, that's all we're looking at, is just that this is a basic good practice to follow when you're looking at backup infrastructure, is ensuring that your backup is recoverable from any given media. So we're not having any single point of failure with respect to backup retention policy. Oh, Fry, my old friend. The problem really is, even if I do that, how do I know that those backups are valid? How do I know that those are good and I can use them? Like Byron said before, we can have all sorts of stuff that happens in the backup media. Somebody runs an electromagnetic electromagnet next to my tape drives, they get wiped. I have the dreaded 2-disk failure on my secondary storage, and now all of a sudden my backups on site are unavailable. But even if that's the case, the backup media itself, if I have some type of bit flip on a backup and now my backup itself, the backup file is corrupt, how do I know if that's really good? I've just offloaded these into files, right? Great, but I haven't really tested the validity of them. So test your backups. Fantastic. Well, what should I do after I test my backups? Well, you don't just do it once. This isn't a once yearly sort of thing. Test your backups regularly, and the more you can test, the more assurance you can get back that those backups will actually be valid, good, and restore the copies as required by the business. So all of those targets, the RPO, RTO, the SLA, the percentage of uptime, those are all great on paper. But if I cannot enforce those from a practical standpoint, those are not being met to the business, and there are going to be consequences that we suffer because of that. There can be penalties to the business unit, or you literally could lose a business because of failure to adhere to those policies. So when we test, and I'm not trying to instill the wrath and destruction upon everyone here. I have seen businesses that have gone longer than a week of downtime because their backups have been invalidated for whatever reason. So we want to test our backups, and that testing takes time. So how do we really triage that? Well, what it looks like from a high level is restoring backups takes minutes to hours, possibly days if I have to call up my cold storage tape provider and get them to ship a tape back to me. Booting virtual machines is not that long, right? So boot a VM, it's a couple minutes. Verifying dependencies, minutes to hours. If I don't have any dependencies, no big deal. If I have dependencies that are multi-application, multi-tier, well, it could take a little bit longer. Maybe I have to have, more of an application group together, and I have to have, or interdepartmental, such as many finance applications, or like Byron said before, ERP. spans the entire length of the business. So maybe I have to have someone from supply chain, from sales, from engineering, from planning, you name it. So dependencies can create a lot of lead time with validation of testing of the backup. So um, when you confirm operational, again, same process. You can have that single use case, single app, single VM instance. Fantastic. If not, that's going to extend your timeline a little bit further. And then destroy and continue. Again, just like booting, destroying and looping back around, testing the next backup. That's a little inconsequential at that point. But if you do this manually, delays are going to happen, just as we've just discussed through. And if you're a single person testing backups, you are the bottleneck at that point. You're going to test in a serial fashion. If I have two people, I can test maybe two backups at the same time, or multiple VMs, but testing an entire application suite. But it's going to be hairpinned by the fact that you only have so many people to do this job. So, Byron, you got stuff to do. I'm not going to hold you to that.
I had lots of stuff to do.
Yeah.
All the things.
You want to test all the backups? I mean,
No.
I'll let you.
No,
no. You can. It's a great idea. It's but I don't want you to test them yourself, right? By the way, that is a very nice hat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
What I really want to get to here is the idea that we should let our computers do the work for us. So most of us got into IT because we saw that there was great value in these machines that do work for us, right? The idea, the basic 101 definition of computer is a machine that does work, right? When we realized that, we said, wow, that's really cool. All right, I'm going to be able to send email, electronic messages. So I don't have to pen and paper message people anymore. No phone calls. This is asynchronous, one way, set up an email, shoot it out in the ether. Somehow someone gets it on the other side. Thank you, computers. So fantastic. And also thank you, Francis Coppola, for this great quote. It's economically inefficient for us to do jobs that otherwise can already be done by machines. So let's focus on that for a second. Don't be Skynet. Don't do that. As long as you're not doing Skynet, then I'm okay with that. But machines for every other job, okay? Thanks. Realistically, what we are talking about here, ultimate goal is getting to SureBackup. So Veeam's SureBackup is a feature in the backup and recovery suite that already provides that functionality. It can mount new jobs, test them in your infrastructure, isolate that network, have a fenced off infrastructure to ensure that duplicate IPs don't exist on the network, you don't have any conflicts going on with your production environment. You also have automated testing at various levels of that application and the VM. So looking at outside in, you've got the virtual machine, which is the construct and software that supports the guest operating system. The virtual machine can be tested to see if it's available. The guest operating system hosts an agent that can be tested to see if it's uptime and available as well. Those virtual machines also have virtual NICs, and those VNICs provide network connectivity, so you can ping that network, that network IP, or connected various ports on that network IP. And also, you can have customized scripts to test those specific applications. So if you know the innards of your application, you know the specific nuances and the things that absolutely define whether or not an application is valid. I think we've all kind of seen the last known good state, last known good configuration of Windows. You blue screen, everything goes all to hell, and all of a sudden you think, well, oh, there's that LGKC. What is that thing? Oh, that's the last time that this was up and running and healthy. So if you know what that state is for your application, you can test that state within SureBackup as well. Fantastic. Well, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at Hyper-V as well as VMware. And with Veeam's new partnership with Nutanix, released at .next in Washington, D.C. this year, if anyone's interested in looking up if Acropolis Hypervisor is supported, we know it's supported with Veeam Backup, So contact your sales team to see what the process is for SureBackup as well. The underpinnings are there. Hyper-V and VMware both share the VM recovery. Hyper-V accomplishes it through instant recovery. Acropolis also uses instant recovery as well. So the process may be similar, but like I said, contact your local sales team, and if that's a good fit for you, see where that is. On the VMware side, we do have to have the addition of a vPower NFS data store. So there does have to be a network storage for those VMs to be mounted on, and they're mounted read-only, so then they're presented back to your hypervisor. So fantastic. So like I said before, what do we test? Well, the OS can be tested for liveliness. We do that through API calls. We can do a heartbeat test, and that's through the guest agents. So in Windows or Linux, you're going to have VMware Tools or Hyper-V integration services. Those are both applications that are installed on the guest operating system that basically communicate back to the virtual infrastructure. Veeam can plumb into that and actually test for a liveness of that agent. Now what that means is your virtual machine can be up, your operating system can be up, but normally those guest tools are the last thing to start when your operating system is coming back online. What that means is you have a full swing of everything on the machine started. So now I don't have any sort of race conditions where I've started the virtual machine, the operating system started up, but I don't know if my application's up or not. Well, normally those tools are the last things to come up and report out on the network. So that's why that heartbeat is important. Like we said before, ping and network probe. So you can say check this IP on the network. You can say check this specific port on that IP address. Any network application is going to use that. So it doesn't matter if it's Apache on port 80. It doesn't matter if it's Active Directory on 389, what have you, right? And also with SQL, specific to SQL is this interesting, use SQL query that we can engage that it will actually contact the database and try to run that use SQL query. And when it comes back okay, then you have the assurance that the database server is up and running and that you can actually execute SQL queries upon it. This last one, Byron, I know you're chomping at the bit to talk to these guys about custom scripts. This is his DevOps background all day long. So take it away, my friend.
Yeah, so this is my favorite part here, right? So the custom scripts part is super powerful. Whether you're on Windows and running PowerShell or Linux and Bash and a cadre of other things, what you can do here is really, really powerful. Especially with some new open source stuff around behavioral testing, things like server spec and inspec from Chef. You can actually do legit tests against your applications to see if they're running in the way that you think they should be running without that much code. Behavioral testing is really great. It can do things like, can I resolve a DNS request? Does this user exist? Is my config file correct? Is my web server up and running and returning a 200 OK when I do a request? All kinds of things. Really, it's pretty limitless as to what you can come up with. So when it comes to not just is my application up or is my VM up, it's does my application work and will the business function happen properly. Custom scripts is where you can really dive in, and there's tons of stuff on the web through various blogs and forums and user sites with examples and snippets to get you started to write these custom scripts. One thing that's important here is you want to avoid false positives, right? So it's very easy to write a test and a script that will pass and not tell you anything. So make sure that when you write a test, you test your test and make sure that it's actually doing what you think it's going to do and returning what you expect. Have it peer reviewed, have someone +1 it and say, looks good to me, before you put it into production. The worst thing that can happen is you write all these great tests, they test the wrong things, you come back thinking that it's okay and it's not. So make sure that, although these are powerful, you test them and you get the results that you want, and you'll get just endless returns here. So really take advantage of this.
Yeah, thank you, Byron, for that. And again, with great script comes great responsibility. So
absolutely.
I had to get a Spider-Man quote in there. So moving on from the testing capability, let's talk about more of the framework of how this process is initiated. So first, we can talk about application groups. What these are is essentially a foundation of your infrastructure services that your other VMs are going to need to be tested. So you may have thought to yourself, well, automated testing sounds great, but if I don't have Active Directory or DNS or any number of actual network services that are imperative to the functioning of those operating systems and applications running, then how am I going to even test that application? How am I going to even test my ERP system when Active Directory is down? Well, this is where your application group comes into play. So application groups are normally that keystone foundation of the services that are providing network functionality, network services back to the virtual machines that you're testing. So it could be an ADDC, email server if you need it, could be web server, DNS, you name it. I like to make the example of in a former life, I was an ERP engineer, and I could create application groups out of an Apache and Tomcat pair, where I'd have two VMs, each running their own, unique application set, but I could change out databases. So, my database was not, it was loosely coupled to that application pair. So I could swap out one database for another in different sites and different data centers and still test those backup jobs with one application group. So Veeam's done a really bang-up job of really separating out what's important from a tiering and infrastructure perspective versus what's the application level testing. So again, this is a dependent list of services. The real important thing about that is if any one VM in your application group fails during the test, the job will fail. The reason being, and this is again a fantastic convention to have, the reason it fails is because these are the cornerstone services. We're saying that Active Directory Domain Controller is absolutely imperative to the testing of these other applications. So if I don't have Active Directory, I don't have the other application, hence no RPO RTO, hence not meeting my SLA, etc. So this is a big red flag. If you have an application group test fail, you want to go back to those backups, see which infrastructure service failed, and ensure that you get a valid backup taken there. So moving on from application groups to linked jobs. So linked jobs are basically the backup jobs you're already taking today. You can plumb those straight into SureBackup and say, well, I'm already backing up Exchange. I don't want to create any sort of specific extra work for me. I just want to use those backups and test them. Well, makes sense, right? So simplifies the selection of virtual machines and pairings in the infrastructure. I can do one or many jobs. I can go down the list, test all those applications, and I'm good to go, right? Well, potentially. An important thing here to note is that they're independent services. So if one specific backup job is tested and that test fails, the other jobs in your linked job group will continue to test. So this is not a one fail, all fails type of scenario like application groups. So FYI, if you only have a single instance, single standalone VM, doesn't require AD or anything of the sort, it is possible just to set that up in an application group and test it. There's nothing wrong with that. That would be a one-off scenario, but we all can kind of think of individual instances where we'd want to do that. Sometimes you may just want to test the application group itself, make sure AD and DNS other services are working, right? DHCP if it's Microsoft DHCP, etc. So that's kind of the difference between linked jobs and application groups. Important to note, again, application groups, infrastructure cornerstones, potentially standalone environment. Linked jobs are going to be reliant upon the application group set, and you can do one or many jobs in here. It's important to use caution when separating these out. So it's possible I could just set up an application group and then I could take every backup job I have and throw it into one linked job and say, hey, look, I'm done. I'm going to test everything. Great. Well, yeah, you can. It's possible. That's going to take a long time. When you see here at the bottom, process simultaneously up to 3 VMs, there's going to be a little bit of contention here. You're going to have a little bit of stagger step because we can't test everything all at once all the time. So be judicious when you set these up. Use a little bit of caution. And when you're setting up a SureBackup job, make sure it's all encompassing of that application set or things that would be interrelatable. how does this really happen? I mentioned before, you're having a network fence. Well, great. How does that really work? So we create a virtual lab that exists on a hypervisor, and that virtual lab is, in essence, that sandbox that we're using to spin up virtual machine workloads from our backups and test. Now, it does use the network that is resident on that hypervisor. Great. Well, how do I segment off? I use a proxy appliance. So Veeam has a proxy appliance that we can essentially masquerade to our production or to whatever network we connect it to. And behind it, it provides what amounts to the natural gateway that all of your VMs would be testing are linked up to in the network. So when you configure, and again, it behooves you to configure this appropriately, make sure that you know what you're doing on the network side. If you don't configure this correctly, you won't be able to reach your VMs from the outside of this connection. When configured correctly, you can actually contact production backups from your production network, and there's no impediment, there's no violation of network services or downtime or duplicates on the network, etc. That's it. That network is segmented off the network. So putting this all together. So we've talked about individual pieces and parts. SureBackup job. First, you're going to configure the proxy network. It's going to do this for you, actually. You're going to configure that in the job, and then it's going to automatically configure that network, shift the configuration settings to the proxy, start up virtual machines, test the application group, testing the link jobs, shut down the VMs, clean up everything. So in the background, important to know, but you may not even touch this, we spin up what are called redo files. So when a virtual machine backup is taken, that backup is stored on whatever data source you have, it's spinning disk, etc. And then when we spin it up through a SureBackup job, we create that localized file, but we have it in a read-only mode, and the redo file is for any writes that may happen. So that keeps that copy pristine. That data is never changed. It's just basically used for a reference point. So when we complete our tests, we shut down and clean up the redo files. We also CRC check our backups. So Veeam is, to my knowledge, the only company that actually does this. We check for data integrity errors. So CRC checks are going to check the actual validity of the data itself. And it's that data on block and making sure that that data is, it's continuous, it has not been changed or violated any sort of means, and it's valid. And then closing up, we got an email, SNMP trap, notifications, etc. We'll see that in the demo coming up here, but again, really well thought out, really well-rounded process for testing our backups and ensuring that we're meeting our business needs while not, taking a full-time employment and having someone do this themselves. So let's go to the demo real quick. So as we see here, I've got our Veeam backup and replication pulled up. We're going to go ahead and create an application group. So backup infrastructure is where most of this configuration is going to live. We're going to go to application groups, and as we see on the right-hand side here, we currently don't have any groups created. So I'm going to go add a group. And for this instance, we're going to do VMware, but you see you can use VMware or Hyper-V. And like I said, if you're interested in Acropolis SureBackup integration, contact your local sales team. I'm not exactly sure if that's available in version 10 as of yet, so I'm going to direct you to your local guys that are going to know a little bit more about it than I do. Go to VMware, and then we're going to type in a name for the job. Easy peasy. So I'm going to next on that. And then I can add a backup, or if I'm using Veeam replication, I can even add a replica. So that's SureReplica is there. From backups, I can choose either from the infrastructure and choose a VM, or I can choose backups directly. We're going to select a backup job. And in here in our backup job, we have EX01 and DC01. Potentially a domain controller, and EX01 could be Exchange, could be something else. So I'm going to add that. Problem being, I don't want my domain controller to start second. I have a reliance on domain controller. I'm going to make sure that starts first. Okay, cool. This is ordination, by the way. This is an ordered set, so these are going to go down the list and start in order and ensure that those are up and ready and running. Here, I go into the role. I check to see what roles are there. So I've already got DNS, domain controller, global catalog. So this is a primary domain controller. I also have the option, like we talked about before, as a mail server, SQL, web server, and also we have an option for Office 365 for testing that backup as well. So Veeam can back up a 365 from the cloud as well. So next here, we're going to look at startup options. Now, we all know virtual machines take up resources. So a certain amount of CPU, certain amount of memory, and a certain amount of disk, and then all of those things have performance tacked onto them as well. So to ensure that we have a certain amount of space and capacity for those, if you have a very large application set and if you have a small test bed that you're dealing with, you can actually reduce the amount of memory that you give to that VM. And here you can dynamically adjust it through the job, 100%, down to 10% if you want to be really mean to that VM, and save yourselves a little heartache and a little time. Startup time, so maximum allowed boot time. So that's if you have applications that really need a long time to come up on the network, that's valuable to adjust that value there. Application initialization, again, we're going to test and see either from our roles where we said DNS, etc. We're going to test to see if that application's up, and we're going to give it a 2-minute timeout by default, 120 seconds. You can adjust that as well. And again, so like I said, my former life running the ERP suite, that database took quite a bit of time to boot up because it did an entire on-disk check, and then it would check all of the data and entries and re-index all the files when it rebooted. So you might want to adjust that timeout to longer because otherwise it'll fail your job. So Heartbeat is present. That's going to be your, remember, your VMware tools or your Hyper-V integration services, those agents that are installed on the operating system. If you don't have those installed, or if you have operating systems that don't really support those agents, you can uncheck that. For our purposes, we'll leave it checked. And then responding to ping on any network interface. If you have multiple network interfaces for a VM, you may have to configure some extra fancy network configurations, as we'll see in a little bit here. But otherwise, too, if you have VM interfaces that are firewalled off and don't respond to IGMP, you can uncheck that, no problem. And then test scripts. This is, again, my dear buddy Byron loves test scripts. I'm sorry, I've been giving you grief about it, but again, these are powerful. This is really where you can specialize, customize, and really craft your SureBackup job to ensure you get exactly what you want every time. So I'm going to go ahead and OK that. We see in here domain controller, DNS, global catalog. We can edit those if we really want to, but for the purposes of our test here, domain controller, it's pretty solvent. These are the exact configurations that we need. So we're going to go next. And summary, fantastic. We're doing that. Great. So I've just configured an application group. So I've got here VM count. I'm a Veeam Infra administrator, and that's 2014. I'm going to create a virtual lab now. Adding a virtual lab in here, again using VMware. We're going to type in our name, virtual lab, go to next, and then here we're going to go ahead and choose our host. Now again, selecting your hosts is an important process. You don't necessarily want to test in production if you can avoid it. If you only have one cluster, if we're running kind of a small medium business shop that we only really have the need for one medium or small size cluster, not a problem. Just ensure when you're selecting those hosts that it's going to be a lower utilized host, or that you have enough space to actually test your backups and not decrease capacity or otherwise have a noisy neighbor or harm your production workloads. So I've got Veeam ESX, so I'm going to click OK. And then in here, I've got the option to configure a folder, create a resource pool. By default, we're going to create a resource pool as the host level, so virtual lab. And then I also have to select a data store. So on vSphere, we've got your data store. On Hyper-V, you're going to have either an SMB share or you're going to have cluster shared volumes. So you can select those summarily as well. Here, I can use local disk. Again, great part about using local disk here, it's not necessarily a best practice to use local disk for for VMware clusters when you're using when you're clustering virtual machines together and you have high availability turned on. But it is a good idea to use local disks for things that are ephemeral, like this testing of a backup job. So great use for that local space. So I'm going to click Next. And then in here, this is what I talked about before, the proxy appliance. So when we absolutely want to use the proxy appliance. If we do not, the virtual machines that we have backed up will appear on the network for our production network. We will have duplicate IPs, we will have problems. So FYI, probably a good idea to keep that checked. Network configuration, we're going to configure this network connection here. And production network is going to be LAN, use my IP, and a preferred DNS server here. Good to go. I think everyone's fairly familiar with this. That's configured any Windows IP addressing scheme. And then we also have the option for allowing the appliance to act as an internet proxy. Now, what this does, it'll proxy web connections out. Use caution here. If you have an application that requires internet connection for whatever reason, maybe a call home service or connects to some sort of SaaS application, etc. Maybe you even have applications that connect, multi-site over your WAN. This would be a place to do it. But again, like I said, use some caution when you're configuring that. Most of the time, we don't have a great need for that. What I said before, we can use just a basic single host automatic configuration and let it configure for us and plumb into what we assume is the network or the production network. If we're in a multi-network configuration, so most of the time we do see multiple networks coming into each hypervisor. It's kind of the beauty of virtualization. We're going to configure a more advanced config. So I'm going to add a production network mapping. Here, I have to actually select where that production network is. So you can see here we've got multiple vSwitches. I'm assuming these are standard switches in virtual in the vSphere environment. So on vSwitch 1, I've got LAN. I'm going to go ahead and select that. What that does is it's going to connect the proxy in software to that port group. You saw before where we configured the actual network interface. That's the IP address and DNS server information that's going to connect to on that LAN network. So now we're actually selecting the software network that we're going to connect to. We have the option to select a VLAN ID. Most of the time, either that's going to be pre-populated, or you can configure that if that is not part of the network itself. So I'm going to click OK, and a little bit of next here. Okay, so here is where I'm going to configure my isolated network. So that's the other side of that proxy appliance. If you remember that diagram we saw before, there are two sides to the proxy. There's the production network and there's the isolated network. The isolated network is going to be where our backup jobs, virtual machines spin up and they connect to this isolated network interface as a gateway. So here we've got a masquerade network for accessing virtual machines. We're going to configure that. This is the network that we're masquerading as. So virtual machines behind this are not going to have any sort of IP conflicts going out onto the network because we're going to NAT route that. We're going to have an interface in between those IP address subnets that do not induce any conflicts. Also, you can enable DHCP. Good practice if you need anything DHCP provided, and then also DNS servers. So you can configure those through that job as well. So I'm going to click OK, and then Next. Here I can define a static IP address mapping. So if I really have a need to have some more advanced networking, or if I have to make kind of a one-to-one network connection, I can do that through the proxy appliance as well. Very robust network appliance. And then summary page. It looks great. Such a beautiful thing. And then another summary page. Now, what this shows is actual configuration pushed out to the proxy appliance. You can see on the right-hand side, this does not take long. This is all network configs that run scripts in the proxy VM, and it configures all those networks on the appropriate interfaces. So this is not, rocket science or high wire acts. It literally is a network configuration that if you know what your production network looks like and you know what your isolated networks wants to be, you can configure this quite easily. So like I said, we spent most of our time in backup infrastructure. Now we're actually going to go to backup replication and create our SureBackup job. So note that we created our virtual lab, we created our proxy appliance settings. Now we're going to actually create our job to wrap all things together. So here, backup and replication, I'm going to go to SureBackup job. I've named it SureBackup. I'm going to next. Virtual lab, already pre-populated, but again, select your virtual lab there. If you have multiple virtual labs, you can kind of bounce back and forth. If you're testing multiple jobs in multiple labs, totally understandable. You can scale this process very easily, where if you want to test in parallel, there's lots you can do to help configure that without any contention. Application group, again, foundational infrastructure services. There was a question on a earlier webinar if we can keep jobs running, if we can keep things up. Well, we can keep application groups up and running once we complete the job, and that could be, you know, an after the task coming back around and having eyes only, right? So if I have to have any manual intervention or any sort of, you know, person hands-on keys has to validate that this works, we can keep that up and going and ensure that that's there for you. Also, if you have multiple linked jobs or if multiple SureBackup jobs, I can say, yeah, keep these things up and running. We've got other stuff coming down the pipe. So good to go. Here, we're not going to do any linked jobs. We're just going to click next, but here I'm just creating that SureBackup job. I can link jobs into those backup infrastructures. If you remember, we created the link jobs earlier, so no worries there. And then job results. This really is my favorite page. So the whole purpose of this is saying, are your backups usable? How do we know? Well, we've tested them. We're going to get the results, and it's going to say yes or no. That's all we really need to know, right? I don't need to know anything more than how to configure this job, and then it tells me if it works or it doesn't. End of story. I sleep well at night. So this is great. We have the ability to plummet into our current monitoring system if we accept SNMP traps. So I can send a trap to my upstream monitoring and say, okay, this job worked or this job failed. And in turn, that monitoring system can ingest that trap and plummet up to, let's say, a knock wall. You know, I've got green, 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 red. Oh, what's red? Oh, red is it didn't work. Okay. Well, let's check into that. Sending email notifications is also a very excellent way of having that kind of validity and assurance. So you basically have a semicolon separation list of, yeah, I'm going to get the report, my boss is going to get the report too, and we're all going to be good. Or maybe my boss doesn't get the report and I just get the report. He doesn't want to hear about that stuff. He just wants to know that it's working. Also here at the very end, job validation, this is your CRC check. So you can validate the consistency of virtual machines on disk. You can skip validation for the application group. Reason being is that if that application group fails, whole job's going to fail. So this is going to be for all, or you can have just for the linked jobs. So I'm going to click next here, and then scheduling is important, right? So I can run it daily, monthly, I can run it after a completed backup job, and then I also have the option to ensure that the jobs complete successfully. So some jobs are a little bit more variable, right? We all know that backup jobs take time. That time is variable depending on what type of job, whether it's a full, synthetic full, or incremental, and also how much data has changed since the last backup. So if I have a significant amount of data change one day, that backup job time can increase. If I don't have any like near zero data change, that backup may take no time at all, especially if it's an incremental. So I can kind of vary this time out and kind of say, like right now, it's got 180 minutes. I think that's about 3 hours if I'm not mistaken. We can really give it some time to have a longer runway to complete that out. So good deal. And then our completed summary page. Here's what we're doing. Great times. I have the ability to run that job immediately. So what we saw previously was scheduling. If we only want to run this once, if it's only necessary to test this just once, just to ensure that the job runs through, I can run it as soon as I finish. So click Finish here. I've created my SureBackup job, and that's going to run never, actually. I didn't schedule it, and I didn't say run when I finish. So you'll probably want to go back there and set that up. So anywho, I know we're coming up close to the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and also we're going to open up for Q&A here. So I believe we may have some questions on the line. I have not been paying attention. My apologies. Um, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please post your questions in the chat window, and we will triage those as they come in. Um, by all means, we really appreciate you coming up to our presentation today and spending this hour with us. We hope you've really learned a lot of great material. If you have any follow-up questions or if you'd like a longer discussion, feel free to reach out to Byron or myself. VMikeB on Twitter, or Byron is Byron Schaller. Um, and also, again, like I said, please feel free to post your questions in chat. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.